Welcome to for joining us for our Special Educational Needs and Disabilities webinar. Today is all about SEND support and our consultation on the funding for education health and care plans. Next slide, please, Dom. If you need to use closed captions or subtitles, please click on the CC button, which you can find at the bottom corner of your screen. This will turn on closed captions and subtitles for the speaker's words. You can also change the caption language by selecting Settings, Captions and Subtitles, and choosing the language that you want. Please be aware that this function is not available, unfortunately, on the Teams app for mobile devices. So, on with the webinar. I'd like to pass you over firstly to the Director for Education and Skills, Catherine Davis. Thank you. And next slide, please.
Many thanks, Louise. And thank you to all of you who have joined us here this evening for this webinar. We're really looking forward to being able to share information with you this evening and also have an opportunity to enjoy a question and answer session and hopefully provide you with further information that is specific to the questions that you want to raise with us today. This is the third, I think, in the series of SEND webinars that we've held this autumn term, and we're really committed to making sure that we do more of these, perhaps monthly, so that we have this opportunity regularly to speak with parent carers across Wiltshire and make sure that we're keeping a really positive, open dialogue with you and hearing directly from families around the issues that are important to you in the special educational needs and disability space. Can I have the next slide, please, Dom? So again, thank you ever so much for joining us this evening in your busy schedules. And what we're going to be talking about today is SEND support and education, health and care plans. And specifically, the theme of tonight's webinar is around EHCP funding. So you can ask questions in the chat as we're talking this evening. Please don't wait right until the end when we have the Q&A session. You'll see that there's a Q&A button that you can click on and then type in questions that will appear to us as presenters that we'll be able to answer later on this evening whilst we're in the webinar. So please do start submitting your questions as soon as you're able. When we talk about EHCP funding this evening, we're going to be talking about how that's decided, how needs are described, and how we can be confident that children and young people are receiving the support that they need. And hopefully the information that we provide to you will answer some of those questions that you've got about that issue. Can I have the next slide, please, Dom? Before we move on to some more detail about tonight's discussion and the consultation that we've got underway at the moment, I want to talk for a few moments about our SEND transformation programme. And some of you who might have joined our earlier webinars that focused on our SEND and inclusion strategy, Meeting Needs Together, Ambitious for All, will be familiar with these priority areas. So I'm just going to refresh our memories really about what those priorities are and what we've committed to as a local area for our children and young people with SEND. Our first priority is around ensuring that we hear the lived experience of children and young people and their families, so that any of the work that we're doing in our schools and settings and as a council and more broadly across the local area partnership with colleagues in health, for example, all of that work puts the experience and the voice of our children, young people and families at the heart of what we do. The second priority is around how we go about as a local area making sure we're improving the support, the skills and the practice so that our children and young people are getting the right support to meet their needs. And we have a really strong focus here around mainstream inclusion and making sure that our children and young people get early help, early support to meet their needs in the settings that they attend across Wiltshire. And that leads us really nicely into the third priority, right support at the right time. And this is about making sure that our children and young people who've got additional needs are receiving that support in the right placement for their special educational needs or disabilities to be met. And because those needs are being so well met, it reduces the need to escalate support to independent special schools, which might be far away from that child's local community. What's really important to us is that children and families have their needs met locally as part of their local community, and that we have that provision available in the local area. The next priority is around preparation for adulthood. And what's really important, we've heard from families and we've heard from young people about what positive transition might look like as young people are preparing for adulthood, and how we need to make sure we're starting those conversations really early, so that as young people move beyond 18 and towards age 25, that we've got really positive options for young people that meet their own aspirations around employment and training. We also want to make sure we've got financial assurance in our SEND system, and that's about making sure that we're paying for the right things at the right time within our system. And that's making sure that the different partners across our SEND system are paying for the right things as well. So across education, across social care, and with our health colleagues, we're making sure that we're paying for what we need and everybody is paying proportionally for the support that's provided. And finally, communication processes and culture. And really, I think this last one feeds through every single one of our priorities. When we're talking about improving communication between all the key stakeholders in our system and trying to make all our processes more efficient and more effective, so that as parent carers, you will feel that you get quicker, better, more efficient responses to the questions you ask, that you've got key people that you're able to link with, and that there's much more transparency and clarity in the way that we work with you and with all stakeholders within our local area system. Can I have the next slide, please, Dom? So just a reminder before I hand over to my colleague, Ben Stevens. Today, we're talking about funding in relation to education, health and care plans. A child or a young person with special educational needs or disabilities might need extra support in school. Now, we know that for most children, this support will happen at an SEN support stage, and most typically can happen within a mainstream classroom with changes that are made through ordinarily available provision. And we've done lots of work with our schools over the last year around OPAL, which is ordinarily available provision for all learners, as part of our work that we're doing with schools around improving the mainstream inclusion offer and helping our schools to feel really well equipped to meet needs of children. We also know that for some children, they might need an education, health and care plan so that their needs are set out within a statutory framework, so that we understand the support that that child or young person needs to access education and to meet the educational aims and goals that are set out in that plan. As part of that EHCP, we know that funding can be attached to that plan in order that that provision and those needs, that provision can be delivered and those needs can be met. And agreeing how that funding is decided is what the consultation is about that we are sharing with you tonight. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Ben, my colleague who's responsible for leading our inclusion, SEND and alternative provision transformation. Over to you, please, Ben.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction. That's really helpful. If we could have the next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about EHCP funding, and I'm sure lots of you will have an understanding of how EHCPs are funded, but I just wanted to run through some of it just to make sure that we're all talking the same language, and that when I'm talking about stuff, you understand what I'm saying and everything like that. So EHCP funding is split into two chunks, essentially. There's the core funding that is provided direct to the schools by national government through the schools block. And then there is the top-up funding, which comes attached to the EHCP as well. And that is what we're talking about tonight. So there's the core funding, that's around £6,000 for mainstream schools and around £10,000 for specials, and then the top-up on top. So the top-up is the money required over and above core funding to enable pupils with high needs to participate in education and learning. That's what the guidance says from the DFE. So this money is there to support children with needs and make sure that those needs are met and that they're able to participate in education and learning. And that's really the key thing. That's what this money should be being used for. And in Wiltshire, the top-up money is derived, we calculate that on banding. And I'm sure, again, this will be familiar to lots of you, but there's bands that run 0 to 4, or they run lower 1, upper 1, lower 2, upper 2, 3 and 4. And so that we have around 7 bands that were introduced in 2016. And these local banding values haven't been revised since they were introduced, and the core funding, that £6,000 or £10,000, hasn't been revised in about the same amount of time. So what we're finding is that schools aren't able to afford the kinds of things that they would have previously afforded on, say, a band lower 2, and so now we're applying for a band 3 or a band 4, and so the descriptions of need that describe what a child who needs a band 4 looks like, what kind of needs they have, those needs and the money that are being asked for no longer are lined up, and so that's where that's starting to cause artificial band inflation is what we've been talking about. But essentially, schools are pushing for more expensive EHCPs when maybe the need hasn't changed. It's just that they can't afford what they used to be able to afford due to inflationary pressures that I'm sure we all understand. If I go to the next slide, please. So we wanted to achieve 6 things with this work stream. The first one was getting alignment back between funding and send need, so that when we're funding an EHCP at a certain level, it's because that it's aligned to that need, and that we know that those things are all tied together. We wanted to make it a simple and fair system of funding, because we've got that system because we've got that issue that I was just describing, where schools can't afford what they used to be able to afford. Schools who ask for band changes or ask for more money access it in a way that other schools maybe don't, and so we just want to make sure that what we've got is a system that is the same across the whole of Wiltshire and doesn't rely on schools going out and asking for extra stuff. We wanted to make sure that our special schools have financial safety. We know that special schools are incredibly important for providing support for those children with particularly significant needs in our system, and we want to make sure that those special schools have the financial safety they need to carry on running, so that we can avoid those independent special school placements that Catherine mentioned earlier, that often mean that children have to travel massive long distances every day to go to school. We want to make sure that our resource bases have a stability of funding. So resource bases, I'm sure people are familiar with them, but they allow children with needs that maybe are slightly more than mainstream, that can be accommodated in a mainstream classroom, to be taught on a mainstream school site, so that they still benefit from being on that mainstream school site. They still benefit from a lot of the life of the school, but they also have a slightly smaller group where they can have more support and more contact time with teachers, so that works. And we want to make sure that those resource bases, again, there's stability of funding there. We also want to improve the descriptors to align with a new understanding of need. So when we started to review the current banding descriptors, it was really clear that some of the language that was used in there doesn't really match what we now understand to be the case with need. There was a lot of stuff in there about behaviour and blaming the child for that, and we know that that's not what we now understands to be the case about children and young people with SEND. It's not about blaming, it's about supporting, and we wanted to make sure again that was reflected in these new descriptors, so that was really clear and up to date. And we also wanted to remove potential friction in the system. So if we can get the system to have clearly aligned need and funding, if we can get it to be fair and simple, if we can get it so that our special schools feel that they're financially safe, there's fewer opportunities for friction in the system, fewer reasons for schools to come to the local authority and say, can I have more, or can I change the banding? And then the local authority have to make a decision, and maybe that's a no, maybe it's a yes, but maybe it's a no, and that then just builds friction into the system that we just don't need. So what we're hoping is that by getting a system that is fully that is better than what we currently have, we can remove some of that potential friction from our system. If I could have the next slide, please. So to get on to what we are proposing in terms of how EHCPs should be funded in Wiltshire, there's two key changes to the proposed approach. So looking at that, the top half of that diagram, we've got element 1 and 2. Now that's what I was talking about earlier, the core funding, that's £6,000 or £10,000 that goes to mainstream or special schools, and that is a national figure that is decided by the government, and so we can't change that. But what we can change is that element 3. However, we do want to make sure that we so within that element 3, we want to have that split into two parts. One is the placement funding. So we want to make sure that funding is allocated that adjusts that element 1 and 2 in a way, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then we also want to make sure that needs are assessed based on accurately, based on both the level of need and also the impact on access to education. And again, I'll return to that in more detail in a second. But those are the two key changes that we're proposing. The element 3 should be split into two, partly based on where the child or young person goes to school, and partly based on their needs as a young person or a child accessing education in Wiltshire. If I could have the next slide, please. So just to go into that in slightly more detail, so this placement funding element that we're talking about, the placement funding bit of element 3, my colleague Liz has done an awful lot of work with our special schools to look at the challenges that they are facing in their finances and to understand how much it really costs to run a special school. Because that element 1 and 2, that £10,000 that special schools receive, should fund their running costs, should fund all the bits of that school that aren't directly to do with the education and support of a child or young person. And what we found through that work is that actually that £10,000 is about £3,000 per pupil short. So that's so our special schools are almost being underfunded by that national figure by about a third, and so we need to try. We know that that's a real challenge, and so part of the idea with this placement funding is that we start to address that and support special schools in that way, so that the other half of element 3, the primary need funding, which I'll come back to in a second, is fully able to support the child or young person. Similarly, resource bases, as I was saying, are a key part of our mix, and we need to make sure they've got adequate support as well. And that is partly about the funding, but it's also about the level of need that resource bases are currently supporting. And we know that there are children and young people in our resource bases who need more support than is currently available. And so we want to make sure that is recognised within this funding. There's a bit more of a challenge about the mainstream funding because we don't currently do placements, placement funding specifically within mainstream. That isn't currently allowed within the legislation, and so there's a bit more of a challenge about how we do that in mainstream. But we are looking again at how we can make sure that we are funding mainstream schools so that they are able to fully support children and young people with SEN in Wiltshire. If I could have the next slide, please. So moving away from the kind of the financial model and onto the needs bit of this, how are we going to make an assessment of how the children and young people and what level of support they need? So EHCP funding has to be based on need. Nothing that we're proposing here breaks that. EHCP funding will continue to be based on need and will continue to be based on what that child or young person needs. But the proposal is then to assess that need based on two elements. So the first thing is a level of need. How severe are the challenges that child or young person is facing? And then the second thing is, how is that impacting on their access to education? How is that impacting on their ability to get to school and to engage with the curriculum and to learn there? So I'll give two examples to illustrate this. So we might imagine a child who was born profoundly deaf, but from a very early age has used a cochlear implant, and so they're able, through that support, to access their lessons in a relatively conventional way with limited amounts of support. And so what you would say there is that their level of need is very high because they are profoundly deaf, but actually the impact on their access to education is relatively low because they're still able to access a mainstream curriculum. They're still able to interact and enjoy the full life of school as part of that. Equally, we might imagine a child who clinically, in terms of how a GP would assess them, would be assessed to have relatively low level anxiety, but that anxiety might be manifesting itself in emotionally based school avoidance. And so while the clinical diagnosis would be low level anxiety, the impact on their access to education is medium or high because they are so resistant to attending school. And we think it's really important that both of those elements are included when we're making an assessment about the support that needs to sit around a child, and therefore what funding that EHCP should receive. What we have currently with the current banding system is just an assessment of level of need, and so it ends up being a slightly more blunt tool, and I'm hoping that those two examples that I just raised help illustrate that. So once we've made that assessment, we can then apply that to a grid a bit like the one on the right hand side that creates 9 boxes, and over time, and then we can look at what that means in terms of the funding that EHCP attracts. Each primary need, the proposal says, each primary need will have a slightly different coloured grid, because I'm sure you can imagine that for some children with, as an example, profound and multiple learning disabilities, they are going to almost always require the highest level of funding, and so that grid is going to look quite red for those children and young people. Whereas there are other areas of need, like, for example, specific learning disabilities, difficulties like dyslexia, where that grid maybe is more green and more orange, because actually the level of support that child needs is going to be less than a child who has profound and multiple learning disabilities. So each grid then looks slightly different, but these will all be published on the local offer and be really clear, so that everyone can see what that looks like and what those grids look like for those different needs. And again, this is all about transparency and trying to make sure that we have a fair system and an equal system across Wiltshire. It's also worth just saying there's no assumption built into the needs element about provision. So what we mean by that is we haven't assumed that every child who is in those high boxes in that red area on that grid is necessarily going to be at a special school, and equally not every green child will be in a mainstream school. There's no assumption built in about the provision type. It's all about assessing the level of need, and then, as is currently the case, the question then goes out to the schools: are they able to provide what's in Section F of the EHCP? And if they can, then the child would go to that school. So there is no assumption built into this about levels of need, about provision types and relating that to levels of need. If I can have the next slide, please. Oh, that's it. We're now on to the question bit. So thank you. I'm hoping that was clear and helps you understand. But yeah, there's now an opportunity to ask questions, which I think Louise is going to moderate for us.
Okay. Next slide. Thank you. So thank you, Catherine and Ben. That was really great to hear from you both. We're now going to discuss some of the questions that have popped into the chat, and I'll ask the speakers to pick up the answers for these. Can I ask, if you've posed a question in the chat, we're really keen to answer those too, but please make them as brief as you can so that we can, it's easier for us to understand what you're asking and be able to answer them fully. Okay, so let's go for Lisa. I wonder if you could answer this question. And what will these changes mean for me and my child? I don't know, Lisa, if you're online and we're able to answer that.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I've just gone on camera. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Fryer. I'm Head of Inclusion and SEND. So the presentation today is, of course, surrounding funding for young people with education, health and care plans. And in reality, if your young person does have an EHCP, then we will continue to be entirely focused on what is the level of need of your young person and what provision is required to meet that level of need. So whether the young person is in mainstream or resource-based or special school, as Ben has indicated, in a way it's almost academic, because we will be looking very much at what is required in whichever setting the young person is. I think that probably answers that, Louise, without getting into too much detail about individual scenarios.
Fabulous. Thank you, Lisa. That's really good. Okay, so Catherine, I wonder if I could ask you, is this about cutting the funding? I know that's always a worry for parents and anyone in the education field. I wonder if you're able to answer that one.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Louise. I think this is a really important question, and I'm sure might be a worry for the parent and carers who are listening in this evening. So this absolutely isn't about cutting funding. What we're trying to do is to make sure that funding is in line with the cost of meeting need. And I hope Ben sort of helped explain that really well earlier in terms of where we've seen those inflationary pressures, and what we're trying to do is bring that stability back into the system. We're committed to making sure that there won't be a single school that's financially worse off due to these changes that we're proposing around top-up funding. So what we expect to see is that the total amount of funding will be the same or higher in terms of how we move forward through this consultation approach.
Thank you, Catherine. That's great. Okay. Ben, I wonder if I could come to you with this question. When will I know how this will impact my child? Again, always a concern for us all to know when we'll start to see the impact of that.
No, of course, and I think it's worth just re-emphasising that there shouldn't be any impact really on the child and young person from these changes, because the school will still deliver the support that they've been delivering. It's just that we're changing the funding mechanism slightly. So the support that's outlined in the EHCP still has to be delivered. In terms, if the question is more about sort of the timeline, then we're hoping to start implementing. I mean, if the proposal is accepted through the consultation process, then we would hope to start implementing it in the next year, and then from the start of the next school year. So September 25, we would hope that all children and young people in Wiltshire were on their new bands. But as I say, there shouldn't really be any impact in the question. It said, how will I know when this will impact my child? There shouldn't be any impact really. That should continue in terms of their support at school.
Great, thanks, Ben. I think you've probably answered this, but I'm just gonna, sorry, Ben, I'm gonna just ask an additional question because it's in the chat. Somebody has asked, how long will the transition period be? And I think you've answered that, but I don't know if I wanted just to make sure you answered it fully for those watching. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got 6,200 EHCPs in our SEND system at the moment, so it's going to take a bit of time to transition all those EHCPs from where they are now on their current bands over to the new bands. As I say, I think our aim is to have everyone on their new EHCP banding by September, but we'll start to put new EHCPs onto the new banding system from the new financial year in April. So there will be a bit of a transition period of about 6 months as we move from one system to the next system. But that's the plan at the moment, assuming again, of course, that this is an agreed proposal.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. That was great. Okay. Let me just have a look. Catherine, I wonder if you could answer this one, please. Why can't you ring fence the money to the child? And why do we need those bandings?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I think that's a good question around how schools are expected to use the funding. So actually money that's provided through Top Up as part of a child's EHCP is ring-fenced to that child and has to be spent on supporting that child's needs. But it is really important that we have a banding system so that we are able to be equitable and fair and transparent in the way that we fund our schools to meet the needs of children who have SEND. We know that banding systems are recognised by the Department for Education, the DFE, and that the DFE talks about banding systems as being clear, helpful in terms of being clear and transparent in terms of those funding arrangements for many types of need that might be met in a range of different schools and colleges as well. And we know that this is the best way, the fairest way, the most transparent way in which we can allocate funding for children with EHCPs who require that in their schools or settings.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. That was great. Okay, another question from the chat then. And this is for and the person that put this in was talking about Liz, was aimed at Liz Williams, but I wonder if Lisa, you would be able to answer this. My child is an EHCP with lower upper band 2 in mainstream, but school have not implemented anything as yet due to staffing and funding. I wonder if Lisa, you would be able to answer that one.
Yes, of course, Louise, no problem. So when any young person has an EHCP agreed, there is always an allocation of funding or banding, as we've been referencing, at the point when that EHCP is issued. And then at any point in the lifetime of the EHCP where there's been an annual review and there may at times be a request for additional funding. So we're keeping those under annualised review, essentially. Where we have a young person, as indicated here, who has upper 2 funding and parent is concerned that for a myriad of reasons, no doubt, school perhaps are saying that they've not got enough funding and or that's proving difficult in terms of putting the provision in place, then of course in those scenarios within the statutory SEND service we would welcome insight from parent to the SEND lead worker to flag that there are concerns and things aren't being resolved to parent satisfaction. And of course in parallel we would have expected school would be in touch with us through formal consultation process and advising us if they had a challenge around the funding that we had allocated. We currently have a model whereby if schools feel that they require additional funding to what has been allocated, they would complete what's called a costed provision map. And it is exactly what it says on the tin. Effectively, the school will cost out what it would cost, what the charge would be for all the elements of the provision as outlined in the plan. And we're regularly in the service on a weekly basis reviewing those costed provision maps. So, it's difficult to tell with this particular question just exactly what the underpinning factors are, but to reassure really that those sorts of queries can be taken back through SEND lead worker or locality team at any time, and it would not be at all unusual for us to be doing that, Louise. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Lisa. That was really good. Okay, another question here. And a really pertinent question, actually, again, a worry that we hear lots of. Will this mean that more assessments by professionals taking away more money from children who need it? I wonder if Catherine, you would be able to answer that question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so I understand that this might be a question that arises if you're thinking about how are we going to be determining the level of need or the impact, but actually no, we're not going to need more assessments in order for us to be able to identify the right funding in this new way of working, because that information is already collected through the current education, health and care needs assessment process, or through annual review, or in the way that Lisa's just described in terms of costed provision maps. Also, the funding that is given to children and young people comes from a pot of funding that is ring-fenced and cannot be used for additional assessment purposes. That funding is there to be used to meet the child's needs. So we don't believe, and we are certain actually, that this won't lead to need for more assessments and money and time being taken away from children by the professionals who need to do that, because that information is already available to us in order for those decisions to be made. And again, just that kind of reassurance really that the process for doing that through this consultation that we're proposing is that will be a very equitable and transparent process.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. That's great. Right, let me just have a little look, see what we've got so many questions coming in. Okay, I'm concerned that the level of descriptors are too high and fewer children will be funded. Lisa, I wonder if you'd be able to answer that one, please.
Yeah, I can indeed, Louise. So, I mean, I think I would want to reassure all on the call that if a young person has a level of need which would be classified as being additional to ordinarily available provision within school, then, by virtue of the fact that a young person was then in receipt of an education, health and care plan, we would be looking at how could we provide the provision to meet that need. So, as far as I'm concerned, sitting here, as head of service, where levels of need are such that they are tipping very much into that additional support arena, then I don't really see any change on the ground in terms of young people having access to what they require. But I'm not sure if there are any other dimensions to that question. I'm just busy looking also at what's coming through. Shall we pause there and see if there's any other questions of relevance?
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. There's lots of questions coming through, and I know people are working really hard to answer them in the chat, but also we obviously want to give an opportunity so we can answer them verbally as well. That's really important. So this one here, of the 6,000 plus EHCPs in Wiltshire, how many are you targeting pushing out of the lower level of funding? I'm assuming this is what the adjustment in banding is for. I wonder if Ben, you would be able to answer that one, please.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. And again, I just want to emphasise that that is not what the adjustment in banding is for. This isn't about pushing children out of support who need support, and we're certainly not targeting any children out of those EHCPs that we currently have in our system to push them out of support. I mean, Lisa started to mention this earlier, but all children who need support within Wiltshire will continue to receive support in Wiltshire. What we are seeing as well is that because we have such really good inclusive schools in Wiltshire, that actually there is a lot that can be done in a classroom setting under the ordinary available provision, and with the support from mainstream inclusion support advisors and other teams. Actually, schools are really good at supporting children and young people already, and so this absolutely isn't about pushing children out of the bottom of the system, and children and young people who need support in Wiltshire will continue to get funded support in Wiltshire.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, that's great. I wonder if what have we got then? Sorry, let me just have a little look at what we've got. Oh, I think I've asked that one. Here we go. Again, oh, sorry. Right. Let me ask this one here. Lisa, why would you not give the money directly to parents to commission their own provision, please?
Well, where young people have an EHCP and they have a personal budget, that is exactly what we do. So we would, in those scenarios, provide a package of funding, obviously with an evidence base behind it, linked to the outcomes in the young person's EHCP, and the parent would then take responsibility for overseeing that package of support. Where we see young people with educational personal budgets, and there are lots of different types of personal budgets, but I think what we're talking about essentially here is educational ones, then obviously if young people are in schools, that wouldn't be typically an effective way to operate, because schools of course need to be able to see what funding they've got coming in, and they need to allocate funding to staffing resource and so on. Where a personal budget works well is for those more bespoke arrangements, perhaps where a young person isn't able to have their educational needs met in a formal school setting, and it's something more bespoke, perhaps a community-based package or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's not impossible for us to offer personal budgets, but the application or the situations where that's appropriate are you know, quite specific. And in terms of how we would support schools and learners with plans within schools, obviously we've got to do that in a manageable way, which means, you know, means in reality that schools then have predictability. They know what funding they're getting for a young person as soon as we've consulted with them and they agree to the placement. They know what funding's coming, and as a result of that, they're then able to put those collective resources together to get the arrangements in place.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, another question from the chat then. How will you make decisions about how the child fits into new band, i.e. a child who is in lower band 2 becomes what? I wonder if, Ben, you would be best suited to answer this one, please.
Yeah, so there won't be a blanket approach where we say all lower band 2s become a new thing. We want to make sure that we are treating every child and young person as an individual and assessing them against that new criteria and assessing them against the new banding guidance and the new descriptors, and that we're then putting them on the appropriate level of funding based on that. So it certainly won't be a blanket decision about moving children and young people from one band to another. In terms of how those decisions will be made, a bit like the discussion and decision groups are at the moment, they're multidisciplinary, with groups with lots of different professionals on who are able to give opinions and look at evidence and look at EHCPs and look at all those bits and understand how to then fit that child into the banding criteria. So we'll take a very similar approach to that, and then we'll also, recognizing that this is a new system and a new process, we'll also make sure that there are opportunities for schools to challenge decisions, and for us to have quite a bit of an iterative process in terms of making sure that we're getting it right, because at the end of the day we want to make sure that that we're making the right decisions to put the child in the right band for the support that they need. So it'll be a multidisciplinary, multi-professional group who will have a process that they will go through of assessing the information we have about the child, understanding where they fit into the new descriptors, and then passing that on to the school for further discussion if needed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. That was really good. Thank you. Okay, another question then. Does assessing the impact of EHCPs alongside need mean moving money away from profoundly disabled children to give more to children with anxiety issues? I'm not sure who's best placed to answer that one. Catherine,
I'm happy to pick it up. I'm happy
okay,
to pick it up, Louise. Yeah. So I think it's really key to just say again that an EHCP sets out the support that a child or young person needs to access education. Like it really should set out what that support is, and then the funding that is attached to it will help deliver that. And the council is committed to making sure that all the children and young people are supported to access education and achieve their ambitions, whether they need support due to a severe physical disability or anxiety or anything else. And as we know more now about the impact of mental health, particularly on children and young people, and when we can look at the evidence of how that impacts future life chances, it's completely right to consider how we assess need and see whether we need to update that, and how we need to make sure that we are dealing with all the issues in a way that is appropriate, and make sure that those children get the support they need. Because that's the one thing that just won't change as part of this system or as part of the broader transformation programme, and that's that the children who need the most support will receive the most support. That won't change, even though we're changing how we assess that.
Okay, thank you, Ben. That's great. Okay. I think, what have we got now? We've got one here about the SEND system needs to so we've got a question about it's quite a long question about long COVID. There are an estimated 1.2 million people in the UK who've long COVID. And this obviously has an impact on fatigue. This is the SEND system needs to own this impact and this need and embed it into all provision and requirements and health services to adapt for those who are too poorly with lack of energy to do so in all the usual things expected of the system without harming their chance of recovery and stability. Please, can you add this to all the lists being discussed? Oh, Catherine, I don't know whether you want to add to it. It's quite a long question, that one.
I'm happy to pick it up.
Is that all right?
Louise,
Sorry,
if that's, or Catherine, if I don't mind.
Yeah, no, yes, please, Lisa. Basically, long COVID, the impact in terms of fatigue and how we adapt provision around that.
So I think the first thing to say really is that we have some young people within our SEND system who have education, health and care plans as a result of having chronic fatigue profiles, of having really long-standing difficulties in terms of energy levels and so on, which mean that on occasion it's actually very difficult to access conventional or formal education. In those scenarios where young people have gone through statutory needs assessment and been determined to require an EHCP, then we will always look at what would be an appropriate package of support, taking account of the energy levels of the young person at a given time. Often it's not a static thing, it will change over time. So we will always look at the situation in front of us and work with the young people to kind of bring to the fore their aspirations and put a package that works for them around them. In terms of long COVID, because that's specifically been mentioned, I would have to say that I've seen little correlation in terms of numbers spiking around young people who are presenting with quite long-standing long COVID symptoms. We are still seeing some requests for statutory assessment or plans where young people have a chronic fatigue profile of need, but I've not seen much of a correlation or link with long COVID, and maintaining that overview of our system and our young people with plans. I think I can say that with reasonable confidence. So I hope that answers that question.
Great, thank you, and apologies if I didn't do it justice in terms of reading it out. Okay, I'm going to just ask another one. Here we go. Let me see. Right. Why can't you ring fence the money to my child? Why do we need bandings at all? I know we've done lots of talk about bandings. Catherine, I wonder if you could talk that through.
Yeah, of course. I think that kind of links back to some of the earlier questions as well, where we were talking about the need for equity, fairness and transparency in the system. So the money in the EHCP is ring-fenced to the child, has to be spent on supporting that child's needs. And what we want to be absolutely sure of in this new way of working, and that's why we're consulting around this, is that at the moment we don't think the current system gives that level of equality across the whole of Wiltshire. And we want to bring that transparency and equality back into the system. And as Ben described earlier about those different elements of the funding in terms of funding the place, but then also funding according to need. And we believe, and what we've put forward in this consultation, is that this is a much fairer way for us to be sure that funding is appropriately allocated to meet the needs of individual children who have got an EHCP.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay. Right, I think this may well be our final question for now, but I know that we'll be we're still scanning those questions, so and answering them as we can. So plans should be completely bespoke rather than have banding. Is this illegal? Ben, I wonder if you could answer that, please.
Yeah, I mean, a bit like Catherine was saying about banding a minute ago. I mean, yes, plans should be bespoke to the child and should meet that child's individual needs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the funding of those plans needs to be entirely bespoke. And lots of councils in England have banding systems, and obviously we currently have a banding system, and we're just really looking to update it and make sure that it's fit for purpose now. So it's certainly not illegal. It's certainly not against the rules or the guidance, and helps us make sure that we are making fair decisions, and also making decisions in a more in a faster and less bureaucratic way. If each individual child had to have their own costed plan that required submission of all sorts of invoices and evidence, that would create an incredibly bureaucratic system for schools to have to manage and for us to have to process, and that would just slow down the system and make it less effective, less efficient, and take longer for children and young people to receive the support they need. So we think that having a banded system is entirely appropriate and helps us make sure that we are ensuring that children and young people are funded to get the support they need in their schools.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, I think we're nearing the end of our session today. A huge thanks for everybody for the really varied questions that we've received today, this evening, and thank you for everybody who's joined us. We'll be sharing the questions and the answers on our local offer pages. Today's session has been recorded as well. So while we may have missed some of those questions this evening, because there's been lots coming through, we've done our best to answer them. We will be answering them and, as I say, posting them onto our local offer pages. Next slide, please. Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening, for taking the time to share your thoughts and your questions. We look forward to working with you as we move forward together. Have a good evening.